Glad to see everybody again. Thanks for joining us. I'm still Kirk Bishop, and I'm happy to be with you tonight. We got a longer agenda than normal. I think we set aside the 6 to 9 o'clock hours to go over material, both new and old. We committed last time to spend the first little bit of tonight cleaning up any lingering comments or concerns that folks have about the second module. We spent 2 hours last time going over it. We got some good comments on many sections of the ordinance. But I know, Jan, you weren't able to join us last time, and we had kind of specifically said that we wanted you to weigh in on this whole rattlesnake overlay issue. We had identified it in the draft as a potential candidate for elimination in light of the fact that it seemed odd to us we had an overlay district in the book that wasn't on the zoning map. But I certainly want you to weigh in on that, and I want everybody to have an opportunity to put other issues on the table with regard to Module 2. But I'm hopeful that we can spend maybe 30 minutes or so doing that, and we will, as we have committed to throughout this process, take those comments into consideration. And in the next revised consolidated draft that we expect to be out the first part of 2009, you'll see our attempts to address those comments where we've been able to do so. So, Jan, maybe since you weren't here last time, why don't you get us started? No, let's not. Jan, why don't you get us started and tell us your feelings about whether the rattlesnake overlay district as text should be retained in the ordinance, and your understanding of the importance of that in light of the fact it hasn't been mapped and all that.
Okay. First, I'm going to speak from 3 different perspectives. My own personal, I'm new in the rattlesnake, so I wasn't around when this was first written. And then I spoke with Mary Manning and Deborah Oberbilling, who were 2 of the wildlife biologists who worked on writing this. And third, I spoke with one of the council members from the rattlesnake. So I'll try not to make that take a lot of time. From my own perspective, I attended the Envision Missoula and many of the other things where I've been put in groups of people to talk about how we want to plan for the future. At the first Envision Missoula meeting, there were, I think, 9 of us at my table. I was more than 20 years older than the next youngest person at the group. And when we were asked to figure out where we wanted 100,000 people to go and how they wanted to arrange them, the first thing several of them did was go right to the rattlesnake, because that is their playground. They said, a couple of them said, where I live isn't much, but this is where I go. This is my open space. And so that's one perspective. Mary Manning and Deborah Oberbilling, the scientists, I could say a lot about it, but I'll just move to them. They said that the area that's covered by the sensitive lands overlay contains habitats for rare and declining species, many from all kinds of flora and fauna. And they're declining because of subdivision and expanded human use. These lands adjoin a huge intact ecosystem, and they provide the bottom end of it. It goes from, let's see if I've got it written down. It goes from the really dense forest down to the savannas and finally down into the grasslands. And it's a natural corridor, plus it has the streams in the forest. And the animals migrate through these areas for their major life stages. So they require maybe a different area for breeding, for rearing, for migration, for training, and so on. They use different parts of the system for different stages in their lives. And if you live in that area, you know we've got cougars and black bears and deer and elk. I mean, we see these things as well as many different species of birds and really unusual plant ecosystems. So she said, the last person I spoke to, Mary Manning, said that there needs to be open space land to funnel the animals across from North Hills to the other side, that we can't close off these corridors, that this is functional open space. And at the time the people got together to write this, it was their intent to let people know what areas needed to be kept open to allow for this flow of animals and plants. And finally, the declining foothills grasslands is a really important concern of theirs. It stores soil carbon in the roots. Some of those roots go 15 feet deep, and it is really essential for certain life stages of the various creatures and plants that live up there. The forests are relatively secure, but our lower grasslands are very important, and they are threatened because they don't have the protections of the government. So they're saying this is a really important thing, that it's Missoula City and County responsibility to preserve this in an intact manner. Finally, my husband spoke with Dave Strohmeyer, and he said he, for one, wants to see this kept in the major document. So those are the reasons I can give you off the top of my head for keeping the sensitive lands overlay.
Does anyone else have any comments on the rattlesnake overlay concept? Okay. Just as a reminder of what was in Module 2, many of you may have come tonight thinking we're going to devote most of our time to Module 3, and we are, but this was the part or the piece of the ordinance that consisted of all the overlay districts, the parking and controls, the landscaping, and the measurements and exceptions part. Go ahead, Brent.
Thanks. We just finished up a series of meetings on the implementation of the downtown master plan. And in that discussion, we've had a lot of discussion about how the downtown master plan will work with the zoning rewrite process. And overlays are an important part of that. We have the neighborhood character overlay, which I think is really important for resolving some of the conflicts that we see between neighborhoods and the downtown, where we see encroachment of the commercial development on that the fringe between downtown and those neighborhoods, where historic character and those kind of things, the residential character of that is being eroded. So I'm very happy to see the downtown character overlay, and I think that's a great tool that we should all look for to help resolve the conflicts that we see in our neighborhoods. My question to you is, we have also talked about a downtown overlay, kind of a CBD overlay that talks about character associated with build-to lines and transparency, ground floor retail. Would you consider that to be part of the neighborhood character overlay, or should we have a separate one for downtown itself?
Sorry. My answer was in the abstract, and I've been a part of a few discussions with the downtown master plan consultants at Crandall Arambula and the OPG staff, who's obviously been keeping abreast of all that. I guess I would lean towards, of those two choices, having a specific overlay for the downtown. I think, though, there's also the possibility of modifying the pedestrian overlay. That's also another option, the pedestrian overlay, which will need some refinement, but I think that could also be another choice, because it addresses things like building location, how parking is sited on the site, the glazing on the ground floor, the whole sort of activation of the pedestrian experience. It's possible that could morph into two flavors of a pedestrian kind of overlay zone. So I think there's a lot of choices about how we implement that. And none of them, particularly bad or.
Okay. What we are very interested in, and I like that. So that would be an additional overlay, or an additional overlay zone to the Module 2, as I understand it, since it's not included now. And we're not interested in we're not interested so much in the details of what that overlay might include, but the fact that we could create it sometime in the future.
Yeah, I think that we could, for example, include at least a placeholder for it as a signal that more work is yet to be done. And that's kind of the way we feel about it. The zoning implementation of piece, I think, is still under consideration and discussion, but it might be a good signal to folks that we're mindful of the time, energy, and money that's been spent on that effort, and that we need to, take the next step in terms of implementation. Zoning is a piece of that. It's not the entire piece, but it is. So, good point. Good point. As I said, just as a reminder, over the past, we've had 4 breakout sessions over the past 36 hours, I guess, dealing with a lot of material that was in Module 4. I know several of you were able to join us at one or more of those sessions. They were really quite productive. We started out yesterday, mid-afternoon, with a session devoted to parking, and we had half a dozen people in attendance. We had a session that followed that up on building height, which was kind of introduced in the last module. We had talked about a new way of a single sort of transparent and predictable way of measuring building height. And so we had a really good discussion about that. Yesterday, we had, at noontime today, we had a discussion about affordable housing techniques, what we've done so far in the ordinance, things we might want to do to push things on a little further. And then ended up at 2 or 3 o'clock this afternoon talking about the cluster conservation and planned unit development options that are in the ordinance. All of those were useful. I learned several things. There was an opportunity to continue discussion, but it was also an opportunity for people to have more leisurely or a lengthier time to sort of talk about issues. And we're going to continue to work on all of these fronts, and the comments that have been provided in written form and in our discussions in the previous ones I will be taken into consideration, and we will be preparing a revised draft, the second draft of the ordinance, here in the coming months, next couple of months. And in that draft, it'll be a kind of a red line, strikeout, and underline draft. So you'll be able to see from the first time we saw the draft to the next time we saw it, what changes have been made. I think in many cases, you'll see that the changes attempt to be responsive. In other cases, you won't see a change made, and you'll be able to sort of question why the change wasn't made. But it'll be a kind of process that'll be easier to track as we move forward. So are there other things in Module 2, sort of lingering issues that maybe weren't able to talk about last time that we should maybe get on the table before we move into Module 3? Yes, David.
2 quick things. I'll repeat something that was brought up in one of those early group meetings. With the landscaping chapter, you're shrubbing us to death. It's 1 shrub per 100 square feet, so it's literally a shrub every 10 feet on center everywhere, which is just a tremendous amount of shrubs. And then the trees, I think, are actually also being overcrowded. It's great for about 3 years, but once the plant starts to actually grow, they squish each other. And then the fact that you cannot, and I don't remember it exactly, but there is something about you cannot count the landscaping where the car overhangs the curb, because the curb is designed to be the stop for the car. And I think that's overkill. That's a considerable increase in landscaping. If, say, you had a 10-foot width and you have to write off 30 inches of that 10-foot width, then that was it.
Okay. I appreciate those comments and the ones you provided earlier. David provided us many detailed comments, both in our discussion last time and in written form, many of which will be helpful to us. Anybody else on Module 2 before we break into the new material? Go ahead, Lee.
I hate to see the historic overlay just tossed aside, and I think at some point with the Southside Plan and the University District, which started development, there should be a little opening there to add them as needed. And then in the last section, the one we're on today, there are a lot of issues which will have parking implications like ADUs and group houses and so on.
Go ahead.
There's a few components to the historic regulations, I think, in the city. One is that fourth bullet that you see there. That's not actually where we say eliminating the park environs and historic overlay. That's not saying do away with the enabling legislation that we have in our regulations right now for creating historic districts. That's a piece of a particular chapter we have in the current ordinance, chapter 19.58, that is called Boulevards, Park Environs, and Historic Overlays. And the only thing that is actually applied, again, that's this question of applied versus not, the only thing that is applied out of that was the boulevard portion of that chapter, and that's where it was applied to the East Brooks portion of our city. The other two components were never applied, and it's almost, so it's not being used, and we have the historic enabling legislation still in place. And only place where we really have a historic regulated district is the fort, and that's still in here as well. So we're not taking any of that away, and we are imagining a placeholder for a historic ordinance should it be approved through the process that the Historic Preservation Commission is going through. So there will be placeholder for that in any future historic districts that somebody contemplates to bring in as regulation. Okay?
Lee, I was also concerned about that, and we've done a lot of talking about that in the downtown master plan. And my resolution of that was that I went back and reviewed the neighborhood character overlay, and I think that a neighborhood like ours could incorporate historic preservation provisions for structures and the character of the neighborhood, and that can be accomplished. That same thing can be accomplished with the neighborhood character overlay. And so the language, I think, could be enhanced a little bit to talk about historical character, but it does mention that. I think the tool is there, and I think that's going to help us resolve this conflict in the future.
Thanks, Brent. Okay, let's go ahead and move to the new material for this round, what we're calling Module 3. I want to remind us that we're still on track in terms of schedule. We find ourselves in mid-November. Towards the end of what we anticipated to be the initial rollout of the draft, we're anticipating that it's be rolled out in 4 modules. This is the third of those 4 modules. This module we're calling, for lack of a better title, Standards and Administration, because it covers a number of use and building-specific standards, but also the procedural and administrative aspects of the ordinance, which are critical and importance. There are a lot of chapters in this module. It's presented here on the first page of the document, the title page of the document, in this slide. This round of revisions was kind of unique in terms of the amount of public input and comment that I received before the advisory group meeting, and it was focused on a particular topic. That topic being accessory dwelling units, ADUs. I heard from members of the AG, members of the advisory group, yourselves. We've had an opportunity to talk about it over the past couple of days. I've heard from citizens at large. I've heard through the grapevine from good folks like Councilmember Wilkins. And in light of the interest that I've received to date, I'd like to kind of start with that, rather than it be the elephant in the room, so to speak, casting a shadow over our entire process. What I'd like to do is propose that I go back to the drawing board on accessory dwelling units. That I not give up entirely on the concept, but that I sort of reevaluate my commitment to this group in terms of not proposing substantive changes to existing zoning districts that were tantamount or could be reasonably perceived as tantamount to a rezoning of those process. Right now, the draft of the ordinance proposes that ADUs be allowed across the board as a separate adjunct accessory activity to any allowed detached house in any district. And people have legitimately pointed out to me that that could be perceived as a upzoning of property, an increase in density, that many people have acknowledged the public benefits associated with the accessory dwelling unit concept, but their fears or perceptions of the downsides outweigh that in the context of established neighborhoods and existing zoning districts. And I made a genuine commitment to this group, as I do all my clients' communities, to listen and to really not have an agenda and push ideas on folks that don't fit Missoula. So what I'd like to do is really pull that idea off the table in its present form and commit to come back to you with a reworked alternative. And the one thing I can commit to in the reworked alternative is that it will not involve the as-of-right allowance of accessory dwelling units in existing single-family zoning districts. We may investigate the use of overlay zoning districts so that neighborhoods could, for example, sort of self-select or request that the ADU overlay be attached to their neighborhood or their small area, and that through a rezoning process it could be carefully considered and people would have the right to show up and speak, and of course the right to protest would be attached to that. We might pursue a conditional use approach in new subdivisions. There might be any number of ways in which we could sort of reshape the ADU proposal to retain what, again, I think many of us acknowledge as potential positives, but not distract ourselves from the overall mission here and the good things that we can accomplish if we don't focus in on a single issue that seems to be as potentially divisive as that issue. So unless you have great objections to that, I would sort of ask your forbearance on the ADU concept and give me another bite at the apple. Let me come back with it in a modified form with that commitment that it not come back as an as-of-right allowance in single-family zoning districts. What do folks think of that? Anybody object strenuously to that idea? Okay. All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. So, and I guess maybe, I don't know if there are folks who have come tonight, specifically to talk about that issue, but it might be an appropriate time, if so, for us to hear about, and I welcome from the advisory group your ideas for how this could be reshaped into something that better fits the city and its needs in the future. Go ahead, Dennis.
Hey, Kirk, I just wanted to comment. You kind of took the wind out of our sails on that one because I think a lot of us were braced for that discussion this evening. I think it's good to revisit it. I guess I'm curious to know historically, how did this even come up in the draft? I mean, is this something that you, Duncan and Associates, have addressed before in other communities, or?
Yeah, it's sort of a part of our standard bag of tools. I think it's really part of our role to, in looking at modernizing the ordinance, to put ideas on the table. I know for you all, this isn't a new idea. You've been around before, and perhaps I should have done a little more careful investigation of the trials and of the past. But I sort of felt like it was my duty. You've been in the meetings and you've heard about folks sort of taking me to task to do more to provide alternative housing types, to address housing affordability issues, to address sort of life cycle housing issues, and I really feel like ADU can be that sort of tool. But perhaps in retrospect, the initial draft of it, I sort of failed in recognizing that maybe I was painting with too broad a brush.
I think the comments might be that yes, as a tool possibly, but to all of a sudden read it in the draft and see that it applies to all zones, it's like, then why are we bothering to do what we're doing if all of a sudden we can open up all zones to that possibility? I think this is the very subject that brought us to this zoning rewrite. I believe it's really the heart of the problem that we told you so much about in the beginning when it comes to the trust issue and things that have been happening before you even were introduced into the picture. Mm-hmm. This strikes right to the heart of it, and so I think that's probably why you had so much outcry and comment about it, because of that. So yeah, I think revisiting is a good idea.
Fair enough. I should probably have done more to prepare you for rolling out tools, and I'll take that under advisement in the future.
I'm sad that I missed all the fun this afternoon, but I apologize if folks, if I'm repeating what is ground that's been covered this afternoon. But I wanted to express my maybe my underlying sort of concerns about affordable housing in our community, and let you, instead of me jumping to a conclusion about a tool to solve the problem of affordable housing in Missoula, I'd like to talk about affordable housing in the context of our neighborhood specifically, which is the university neighborhood. And then maybe you can take that into account in coming back with a new idea. We have, in the university neighborhood, we have a lot of houses that are occupied by college students. It's a rental. We're a university neighborhood, and there's not a problem with that, other than we see a continual transfer of the owner-occupied to a rental situation. We start to lose some of the fabric of our neighborhood with a more transient sort of neighborhood. And truly, it's an issue of supply and demand in the marketplace. And if we increase the supply of housing, the price will come down. And if we increase the supply of housing for students, they won't have the desire to live in those single-family houses any longer, and they'll go back to being families. So we need to do something about finding student housing in that neighborhood so that we can start to see the conversion of those single-family houses back to owner-occupied houses. So I think that's a value that we probably could all agree that we share. I would hope to that. And so that's the underlying thing that we want to get to. Now, ADUs is one way to get there, but we know that there's a lot of issues that come out of that. So if we can solve the problem, increase the housing supply, and get the price of that housing down, I think that's going to be good for our neighborhood. So.
Good, thanks.
I guess the one thing I looked at the existing code, and it actually says there's accessory dwelling units, but it really doesn't go into any detail on it. So I guess I really appreciate that there potentially could be an ADU section, which would actually define what has to occur with it. Maybe some way of doing it. This was, we had a client that added a garage behind their house, and I thought it was a slick way. I guess my understanding was in the zoning. But basically, all the neighbors around his property, or that attached to his property, basically had to sign a letter saying they agreed that you could do it. And it's something in the zoning that allowed it. So maybe that's some way, basically, you'd have to be, I think, a good neighbor And you'd have to prove to all of your neighbors who you have to live by that, you're gonna, if they allowed you to do it, you would be responsible, and then somehow it'd be tied to the title. Maybe that's a way you could accomplish an ADU, and quite honestly, it really wouldn't matter the zone. I mean, 2 houses on the lot, no matter what density of the zone, definitely has a slightly different feel than just one.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm a guy talking, I've got 2 houses looking right into my backyard from across the alley, so, I know the effect you get, but, I think if a person went out and asked their neighbors, and as a requirement, and, they got to get 80% approval or something like that, maybe that's a way that wouldn't be prohibitive to someone that's like trying to get their mother, closer to them or something. Thanks.
I'd like to comment on that idea based on experience I had. And as an association president, I know that neighbors never like to say no to their neighbor because they like to be good neighbors and friends. I had an instance up in my neighborhood where a man wanted to build a garage, a separate garage, and it blocked the view of a couple of folks across the way. So our association approved it, our architectural committee, but under the stipulation that the man would go around to all his neighbors and get there to sign approval. Well, he did that because, again, I don't think the neighbors wanted to say no, but when it came up to the Board of Adjustment here, why these neighbors had rethought that and took another position. So I'm just saying, I'm not too sure that it's a fair, workable idea that you have there, really, from that standpoint, You're kind of putting the pressure on your neighbors to agree to something they don't really want.
Yeah. Lee?
When the university built the Lewis and Clark complex, it took a great deal of pressure off of the neighborhood. And the university has, 9,000 some students off campus. And that's quite an impact. If the university were to step up and provide much more housing, you would at the same time create a lot more affordable housing because the students are in direct competition with the other folks who want to rent. And I think you have to go back to the university and say, come on, guys, you owe more than what you've done. If you're constantly increasing your enrollment, at the same time, you must do something to look after the issue of housing for the kids. And the Lewis and Clark has been very successful. They're nice units. The kids like being there. They fill. The married student housing does also. And so it's one of these things that I think you're absolutely right about. The other thing is apartments within houses. It is legal, absolutely legal, to have a tenant as long as the tenant shares the living space with you. For instance, shares the kitchen. That's usually the main item. And that is a legal use. And actually, a separate apartment in a house is not. So if we can tell people that, yes, you can have a tenant, but the tenant is part of the household, so to speak, and that's what State v. Stewart, that lawsuit, was about. And it did define it very clearly. So I think there are different ways to skin the cat. As far as coming up with a new ADU possibility, perhaps it should be broken out by each zoning district specifically, like what is allowed, because it is hard to read through some of the documentation otherwise and figure out where it applies and to what degree and all that.
Thanks. Yes, we definitely want to take public comment on this issue. Would you like to do that now, Councilmember?
I know you all know me, John Wilkins. I'm very glad you're taking that back and going to look at that, because there was a storm brewing in Missoula that was probably worse than Katrina over that issue. So I'm very happy you're taking that back and do that. you know, Mr. Gray, when you say about the neighbors and stuff, and I look at the Franklin LaForte, and I've talked to people that own property over there for 25 or 30 years, and they're devastated what's happening to the Franklin LaForte. I agree that maybe ADUs could be used in where duplexes are and things like that. When you look at R1 and A, and especially in Missoula, Montana, I live in an area that we sometimes only have 25-foot wide lots and 30-foot wide lots. And so there's always that potential when you start sticking a house in the backyard that then lots could be divided. So I want it firm in whatever you do that once a house straddles those two lots, it becomes one lot. And then you look up in the South Hills, and especially the Southeast Hill, you've got lots up there, single lots up there that are 10,000 plus, and that's in a R1 or A zone, single family zone. So it makes me nervous when you start talking about you can put ADUs on lots like that and what might happen to those lots in the future. Though I know they're supposed to stay with one owner, but you know, I can give you examples in my neighborhood where these little 30-foot wide lots all of a sudden became 3 houses, which never happened in our zoning because you were supposed to have 5,400 square feet. And that was allowed by an overlay, the PNC overlay. So overlays scare me too. And you know, when they did an overlay in my area, there was no right of protest on any of that. So when you just said now overlays, it would be change of zoning and it would have the right of protest. That's all we're asking for.
Yeah.
So when they do an overlay, I'd like those stipulations in there. And then when you get further down in the modular 3, I have some other comments.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead, Judy.
Since I'm not going to be able to stay too long, I'd just like to add a counterpoint here. I think we do have a polarized situation over this, but some of us actually do support ADUs, particularly in some parts of the community, and we do see them as an affordability tool. So when I read it in here, I figured that was what you were doing, is responding to some of the conversations that some of us have really urged you to look for tools. So I appreciate that you did, and perhaps you didn't do it in the most graceful manner in introducing it here. But there is a very strong interest by a significant number of us on the advisory and in the community to figure out how to actually provide mix of income housing. So I think ADUs is a potential, and I appreciate you looking at various ways to do it. I think it would be regrettable if you restrict them just to particular areas. It may be that our community needs to have this conversation, but I realize that the zoning rewrite was never seen as the place to maybe have it. But I think we do eventually need to have it, because if we just keep over and over again saying the folks that need affordable or something are going to be in this part of the community and not in this part of the community, we just create a situation where the community is divided more and more. So thanks for putting it in. I appreciate it. I think there's a lot of folks who will be interested in seeing what you can do with it so that we can keep it something that is available. I agree with David that I appreciate seeing the specifics around it, because before it's always just been called a ADU and didn't talk about the detail of having it look like the first house, the materials, the heights, the entrances, and I think that's the kind of thing, if we firmly define it, it will be less frightening for folks.
Good, good. Well, as I say, I'm not backing away entirely from the concept, but it will be in a substantially reworked form. Yeah, go ahead.
Lynn Hellegard, Ward 4. I was at a neighborhood council last night. One of the discussions that centered around these ADUs is that they have this stipulation that the main unit has to be owner-occupied. The city has absolutely no way to enforce that. So the neighbors are very concerned that the city, without that enforcement effort, turns pretty much everything into investment property, where you go in, you buy a single home, you keep your name on it, you move out of town, you put another house on the back lot, and the neighbors are stuck with more and more rental units, more and more parking problems. So without that enforcement effort on those ADUs, or a way for you to figure out how the city can enforce those, I see that as problematic. Thanks.
Anyone else from the public want to talk about ADUs before we move on? Yes, sir.
Just briefly, I'm Mike Kupchak from University Homeowners in Okay. University Homeowners has some strong concerns about all right. Very complex. University Homeowners Association has some strong concerns about ADUs, and we see issues with regard to parking, overloading existing infrastructure, concerns with street and alleys. So we're concerned about that, and also some other issues with regard to Module 3, which we can comment on later. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, anybody else on ADUs before we move on? Yeah, Heather.
I know we talked about this in committee a little bit, and we had our back and forth, and I appreciate you bringing it forward, saying you'd like to work on it some more. I do want to speak on behalf in support of the ADUs, but I think that as long as we're addressing, as you're going back and rethinking it, if you could listen to what the concerns are. We talked about it at the committee level. The parking, the access, maybe it doesn't fit into, and I don't want to go neighborhood by neighborhood, but maybe it's situation by situation. If there's not alley access, maybe that doesn't make sense to have an ADU there. I live in the Franklin to Fort. My neighbor has an ADU, and it's how it's managed. He's managed to stay in his own home with a disability, and I've met great neighbors at the ADU, and I think we all have those stories. So I don't want to just throw everything out. I would love for you to go back, and I don't want to strip it from certain zones and put it only in, I think it's more of a conditional, situational use problem, as opposed to you can't blanket a single neighborhood and have a one right answer. So I just would love for you to go back and be thoughtful, and if there's other resources you can pull in from other examples, it'd be a good conversation that I hope we can continue to have on a productive level.
I too would like to support the concept of leaving it in somehow. I think that one of the things Missoula needs is diversity in housing. And as we get more and more regulation, not just with zoning, but other regulations, it continues to push the housing effort in one direction and essentially one price range. And I think ADUs would be a way to create some diversity in housing and help with the affordability factor. If we can do that in such a manner that we don't isolate one neighborhood as being able to have them and one that can't, I think it needs to be fair. The diversity in housing isn't a bad thing in any part of Missoula. As long as the right of protest can be part of the process. I know there are quite a few people here that feel very strongly about their neighborhoods. Those people aren't going to be here forever. Neighborhoods age, houses age, and parts of Missoula need rebuilding. And there needs to be flexibility and options for doing that. And so, to echo what was said, if we can do that in a manner that takes into account some of the concerns that these folks have, I think it's a good thing.
Along those lines a little bit, this is not anything new in the university neighborhood, and I would encourage people as they walk through the neighborhood, and when this whole discussion started to occur years ago, I started to look at especially corner lots and how many pretty obvious garage situations had been converted to houses, and probably back in the 20s and 30s in the university neighborhood, and that really densified the neighborhood. And so if you go through the neighborhood as you start and look at those corner lots, they're on very shallow, a lot of the front house is on a very shallow lot, and that side house is on the side street. And that was absorbed into the neighborhood in the 20s and 30s in a way that we now accept and kind of assume was always there. My house, it was the garage of the house, the Sterling house, which was the big house on the corner. During the Depression, that was subdivided and the garage was converted to a house. So this has been going on for a long time. It has absorbed into the neighborhood and now has become a part of the fabric of the neighborhood. It was done in a way that worked. And so corner lots are one of those examples, that has worked in the past.
I just want to follow up on what Brett said, that most of those structures were built back in the 20s and 30s when the university enrollment was maybe below 1,000, and every household didn't have 2 cars, so the impact on the neighborhood was one heck of a lot less back then when they were built than it is now. We're in a totally different era, and the concept of ADUs was probably acceptable back in that time, and they were used for separate income for the homeowner, but it's a whole different world now, and impacts are huge.
One of the issues here is the idea of rezoning. If you have a single-family home lot specifically set up for that purpose, and you buy it with that intention and that predictability, if we were to drop ADUs in the backyards, that property has become rezoned. It has doubled in density in terms of the house. And I think that much of the reaction is that this would have a tremendous impact on the neighborhood, and it would have a firestorm from those people who expected their zoning to be protected and that it couldn't be manipulated at some point for some other purpose. Now, if other areas want to adopt, or it's feasible to adopt ADUs where it's not single-family detached homes, I think at that point, then look at it and make very careful determinations. But again, it might have to involve also the protest rights, because across the city there's quite a reaction to these. Because you can have good rentals, but you can have some really, really bad ones too. And so that effect is something, so I think that you're touching on rezoning is exactly what the problem was.
Okay. Well, as I said, there's a lot in Module 2 that, or Module 3 that we probably want to talk about tonight. I think we'll stick with our standard practice and go around the room and have you kind of identify for us the major questions, issues, and concerns that you have as you've had an opportunity to look through Module 3. And Michael, maybe we'll start with you.
I'm sorry.
Doing
something else to say. Why'd you pass?
Okay.
I'm going to leave the BOA discussion to Michael since he's the head of the board. And deal a little bit with non-conforming use. And I noticed that in the non-conforming use chapter, especially with lot and building site, that there isn't a time specifically put in there. Originally in the document, it basically said, and this is from the Haynes-Ballas lawsuit, it says, however, the city's ordinance MMC, and then it lists what it is, treats the original separate building right for each lot as abandoned or lost if no separate building occurred on each lot by 1951, the year after annexation into the city. And each area will have been annexed into the city at a different time, but that older district came in 1950, and the law basically said, if it isn't built on within a year when the zoning went into effect and the annexation went into effect, then that issue is abandoned. It doesn't mean that the property is useless. It always can be sold off to neighbors or to other interested parties, but it may not be a building site after that point. that was one of my issues with nonconforming use. And I also have a lot of questions, which I think we need to have a breakout section to go through all the administration and enforcement business, because there are too many questions to grind through it tonight and ask every single one of what it means on the review and approval procedures and so on. There's just maybe 40 pages of extreme detail that I think it's going to take us a while to go through it in detail. Thank you.
Fair enough. That non-conforming lot provision, you're reading from a judicial decision. Did that language ever find its way into the existing ordinance?
It is in the existing ordinance.
Under the non-conforming lot provisions?
MMC 19.62.040.
Okay. Yeah, we were looking. You were kind enough to give me a heads up on that one today. I didn't realize that we had made a substantive change and we weren't able to find it, but perhaps that reference.
It's the 1950 piece there.
But that 1950 language that we find in the ordinance applies to non-conforming structures and non-conforming uses, but not non-conforming lots. That struck me as odd, since you're talking about.
I believe from Judge Haynes's, it's the use of the lot as a building site. I mean, if I wanted to read more of this, but
Okay.
I think that we need to be careful to be sure we document the times when annexation or when zoning came into effect, because there was a 1-year window in which you could use it without complying with the zoning, and then after that, it became much more restricted.
Okay. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Great.
I was signing in when you asked. That's okay, Laval. And I didn't hear all of your questions. Did you ask me to address the 2085.080 variances Board of Adjustment?
I'd really like to hear from you about your concerns and issues with what you saw in the draft generally. But,
Okay.
Zeroing in on anything.
Well, starting then on at the very first paragraph, A, intent. This is at 2085.080 variances. I think I addressed this in several emails to Tom Zavitz and that were forwarded to you, but the state law, well, first of all, let me read what you have. It says zoning variances are intended to address unnecessary hardships or practical difficulties resulting from strict application of zoning ordinance standards. As I mentioned in the emails to you and Tom and Laval, state law does not allow the Board of Adjustments to issue variances based on practical difficulties. Dick Haynes and I tried to address this several years ago, but got nowhere. The ordinance the state statute in question restricts variances only for undue hardship. And if the state enabling statute says undue hardships, that's the only reason for which we can give a variance. So that, in my opinion, you would strike the words or practical difficulties from that paragraph. Going on down, I didn't have any difficulty with paragraph B, C, D, or E, or F. There's some language changes I would suggest, and this is only because I was a city attorney for 45 years, and I never used the word must when you're compelling a person or an agency or a body to do something. The word is shall. So F1, the Board of Adjustments shall hold at least one public meeting on a proposed zoning variance. And then wherever in the following paragraphs the word must is used, would change that to shall. In paragraph G4, again, you would delete or practical difficulties, and there's no need for the modifier invariably be suffered. An undue hardship that will be suffered would be sufficient language. Again, in H1, you would use shall instead of will. and I had no other comments. The extension of the life expectancy or life term of the variance has been extended in the draft to 2 years instead of 1 year. Again, this is something that we discussed in emails that went back and forth. Tom pointing out that the way things generally go in the construction industry is that it takes time to get a building permit, certificate of occupancy, or actually build something, so that he felt, I guess you felt, that 2 years life expectancy for a variance is probably more reasonable given the circumstances than a 1 year. I have no difficulty with that. All of this arose, the 1 year is something new, because one of the persons in the audience suffered a grievous wrong some years ago. She may want to address that, but I think it's addressed in the ordinance. And that's when there was no time limit on variances, and a variance that had been given years before on a vacant lot was brought to life with unfortunate results for some neighbors. So I don't have any difficulty with a 2-year life expectancy. And then all the way down to you have an administrative variance. This is something new. And again, I think that would ease the burden on the Board of Adjustment. This is in 2585-100.
2085, yes, 100.
2085-100. I think some deliberation should be given to the date where it says insert effective date on paragraph 8, lot area, subparagraph B. As you probably know by now, there's been a fair amount of litigation over actions by the Board of Adjustment, which I'm happy to say, all of which affirm the Board of Adjustment, over permitting or granting variances or denying variances, more properly, for structures to be built where there was less than the minimum lot area. So I urge you to spend some time looking at whatever date you want to insert. And then lastly, where you have an editor's note, I disagree that an administrative or a staffer, one person, should grant administrative adjustments for building setbacks to address unusually narrow, oddly shaped lots. You asked the question, should we do that? My answer is no. One of probably the most common variants that we address on the board are setbacks, and sometimes those requests for setback variances take a lot of time and to address, and it's not always and generally isn't unanimous. So my reasoning for not changing the ordinance to allow for administrative setbacks, adjustments for setbacks, is that I believe the collective consideration of a 7-member board is better than one person at staff level. With that, I think the rewrite is well done, and I just encourage you, and if you want, and you probably already have looked at the state law, it's very clear, undue hardships only. So with that, I have no further comments. I think you did a very nice job.
Well, thank you. That's very nice of you to say, and I appreciate your comments. I feel like I'm kind of a little bit caught in the middle on this practical difficulties issue. To be honest with you, I was hoping that I could simply say, "You're right. I've read the statute. The plain language says unnecessary hardship." But the city's legal counsel feels that other provisions in the state statutes, specifically related to air space controls, where practical difficulties are a valid consideration for the granting of variances, is somehow, and I'm not doing justice to the argument, but somehow a compelling reason to retain practical difficulties as a criterion. So I guess I'm going to let the attorneys debate this, since I certainly can't interject myself.
Right, I understand that. We, as a board, have asked for legal guidance by the city, and I received somewhat, and Lee, I think, would agree, received somewhat the same type of advice. My experience, although it's in another state, would, I think the law, at least in that state, was that if it's the statute that authorizes a particular board that says something, that's the statute that controls. I'd hate to see this city get sued because some neighbors didn't like a variance granted on practical difficulties, took it up to the district court, and have the city lose after spending some legal fees and putting into question other variances that were granted on practical difficulties. I think the best way to address this, if the city attorney and the city council want to have practical difficulties in this ordinance, ask one of the senators or representatives in the upcoming legislative term to introduce legislation adding that language to the enabling statute. That would be the cleanest way to handle this. Otherwise, we're in a cobweb.
Well, this will be an item that we'll continue to discuss and deliberate on, and I appreciate you. I was careless in simply carrying over the existing language of the ordinance. Had I remembered to look back, and I had read the statute, and it just escaped memory that unnecessary hardship was called out, I probably would have changed it in this draft, and then later been told to change it back. So we'll continue the conversation, but I appreciate you bringing those to our attention.
You have several people from the audience who would like to address.
I think it will follow the format that we followed previously, and at the end we'll reserve comments on we'll take public comments on Module 3. But for now, let's continue around and let our advisory group members put items on the table for us.
I'll pass. I think we already hit the high points of what I want to talk about.
Good. Thank you, Dennis.
I've got several items, so I'll try to be brief. Under bed and breakfast, I think I'm correct in that the current zoning regulations does not allow bed and breakfast as either permitted or a conditional use in most of the residential zones.
Section 2040-30 are the bed and breakfast, just for everybody's benefit.
I know that.
Here. Okay.
Yeah.
I know you do.
Okay.
I thought I'd let everybody know.
But then your Module 1 made bed and breakfast a conditional use in basically all the residential zones, as I recall. Now, if you look at later on when you get into the procedural part where you have a conditional use procedure, I think you'll find that the Design Review Board now has the final authority to decide all the conditional uses. And if you look at the laundry list of considerations they're required to go by to make that decision, in my opinion, very rarely would a bed and breakfast be rejected. I think the bottom line here is the way it's written that we've kind of got a blank check here for bed and breakfast to go in any neighborhood as a practical matter, and I'm not sure that's what folks would like to see. I really don't know why we want to override the existing restrictions on bed and breakfast. I don't think they would do a lot for our community, and they would cause a lot of conjecture and unhappiness with the neighbors. Once again, I think they would devalue the quality of life and the property values of an adjoining property. On the next item, I've talked about this at every meeting, and that's got to do with casinos and taverns and nightclubs. You're proposing, for simplicity reasons, to eliminate some of these overlays like CLBs and things. and fuel station overlays, and I agree that's a awkward process, and we need to get rid of as many of these awkward processes that take city man-hours as you can. But I still don't think that you've recognized the situation, because you have a write-up here in your Module 3 here about those casinos, taverns, and nightclubs, and really the only restriction you have in there is that they can't be built closer than 300 feet from a residential district or 600 feet from a school, church, and so on. That's kind of like a city block away or 2 city blocks away. When we went through this with the neighborhood council, probably almost 3 years ago now, as a result of a face-off we had up in Grant Creek with the town pump people, where the entire valley was opposed to a casino north of I-90. What you've done here with your procedures you got there now is that would automatically be allowed. And I think that people were looking at a bigger picture than 300 feet from a residential neighborhood. So that's my comment on that one. And the same goes with gasoline and fuels, that try to eliminate the CLB on gasoline and fuels. The only thing you say here is some very elementary requirements for a gasoline station. You haven't recognized the difference between a neighborhood station and a large truck stop operation. So, you know, if you don't have an opportunity for citizens to comment, and here again we met this with Town Pump, you've got to be able to say, look, put another island in, okay, or a gasoline station with an island, but you can't have a big truck stop with showers and the whole smear here. So you got no way to control what sort of a gasoline station is going where, unless you have an opportunity for comment, which is brought about by the CLB process. The lot line house thing, like I mentioned this afternoon, I think it has potential in a newly designed subdivision where you can treat the entire subdivision under those guidelines. But what I think people are concerned about is for somebody to bring in an accessory building in their backyard and be allowed to do so under this criteria of a lot line location. In other words, you're waiving the side setbacks. I don't think that's good. On temporary uses, these are things like Christmas tree lots and all these sorts of things that are allowed during seasonal things. It seems to be that that's, well, you've written it, that would be permitted in residential zones as well as commercial and business zones. And I don't think those temporary uses of that type are appropriate in a residential zone. Now, next you go to accessory structures. What your write-up says essentially is that these would be allowed in residential zones, buildings up to 22 feet high, only 5 feet from the side of rear setbacks. And there's an unlimited number of these would be allowed. There's nothing specified as to the quality of the structure. And that they can occupy up to 50% of the entire backyard. So here again, I think that's overdone. There's too much there. I don't think anybody wants the neighbors to have several inexpensive shacks put in their backyard, 22 feet high. So I think you have to do a little bit better on controlling that. Basically, I think the buildings in the backyard should be of the same quality and architectural treatment and quality as their basic house. Home occupations. Certainly there's a place for home occupations, and that needs to be defined. A lot of people can conduct their home businesses inside their house without anybody knowing any different than what the residence would be. But I think you've gone a little bit too far with this definition here. You're talking about allowing one employee. That may be okay, again, under certain circumstances. But you're indicating there can be up to 3 customers in the house, clients or customers in the house at any one time. You're saying they can do the work in their garage, or as I presume, in an accessory building in the backyard. So you can imagine someone fabricating cabinets in his accessory building in the backyard with one employee and having customers and clients coming on a regular basis to view his handiwork. I think that's leaning more towards a commercial business in the neighborhood as opposed to what we would like to see for a home business. I think you ought to take a look at that one again. Accessory dwelling units, I commented pretty vocally on that one. I don't think they're good. And the last thing, on the review and approval procedures section, someone mentioned, I guess, a minute ago, that that's a very voluminous thing, and it's really hard to digest as to whether this is an improved procedure or just a rewritten procedure. I don't know whether you've tried to do an analysis to whether you think what you're requiring in that procedure streamlines the process, reduces city man hours, or whatever. But you certainly can't tell from reading it without doing a lot of work on your own. And I think we need to streamline these processes because I think there's too many man hours of city staff being incurred, with budget restraints that they have. I think we need to transfer to those man hours, some of those man hours, out to the field, policing the streets and fixing the streets. So you should analyze this and see whether this is a simplified procedure or whether it's just a different procedure. I don't see very much different in it, really, frankly, that little chart you've got in the front there where it says who approves what and the processes you have to go through. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're all state law dictated, but we should try to improve the situation. I wrote you a letter, I analyzed 35 steps at one time on one process had to go through, Oh, yeah. Don't mention the committee meetings and the city council committee meetings and all that sort of stuff that isn't even on your chart. So thank you.
Thank you.
I made a much shorter list this time. I was glad to actually see that there's an accessory use chapter because accessory uses right now are basically carte blanche, wide open. It's accessory to the building. So it was actually nice that there was some actual definition to accessory buildings. The one I don't really understand on it is a 10-foot separation between the buildings. So I guess I don't see why a doghouse has to be 10 feet away from your house and the yard shed has to be 10 feet away from the doghouse, and then it has to be 10 feet away from the garage. I guess I didn't quite see the justification for that. Small buildings like a yard shed, you're not required to get a building permit for if they're 120 square feet or smaller. And if you don't have to get a building permit, you're sure as heck not going to get a zoning compliance permit. So those, I think, should still be allowed up to the property line. Skip ADUs. In the BOA chapter, I was just curious, maybe there's a legal reason you can't, but why can't BOA appeals go to the city council or district court? Because right now, the appeals, it said, can only go to the district court. To me, it seemed unjust that you couldn't bring it to your city council. Unless there's a legal reason.
There is in most states. I haven't committed to memory the statute, but as a quasi-judicial decision-making body, those decisions are usually by statute mandated to go to the courts.
Oh.
That's, in my experience and opinion, is true. In some states, and I could say certainly in California, which I know, decisions of the Board of Adjustment. Well, there are no boards of adjustment in California. There are planning boards and city councils period, and now and then design review boards, and that's cities as big as 500,000 people. Here we have a lot of different boards doing a lot of different things and a lot of duplication, in my humble opinion. However, in this state, we're a quasi-judicial body, and by statute, we go to the district court. In most cases that I'm aware of, a planning board or a board of zoning adjustment, the appeal from that decision would go to the city council.
Oh, okay.
But not in this state.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
In, I think, administrations, I think something needs to be added for when a violation has been given to the city, or the city's been made aware of a violation, that the city actually must act on that notification of violation within some kind of time period. I did run into this one time, and when the city was made aware of it, it wasn't until 6 months later that they acted, and you know, if they would have brought it up much earlier, it would have been a piece of cake to fix. It wouldn't have been any big deal. So just something in there for that. And then I actually have quite a bit just in the definitions. I think the building code needs to be defined just as the current adopted building code. It's an international code. The state legislature amends it. The city amends it. But I think you need to say, don't ever say specifically what building code, only the building code, and leave that as the current adopted building code. And then you just always conform. You'd be fine. The definition for dwelling units, I would actually wipe it out and just say it is per the building code. The building code defines what a dwelling unit is. The yard pictures you have, front yard, side yard, and rear yard, it's really confusing on whether the definition says the yard, the side yard or the front yard is between the building and then the property line basically adjacent to it. But it shows the exact same picture as the side yard or the front yard, but it doesn't show the building. It says it only happens, it shows it as if it's only happening between the setback and the property line, but it says in definition, the building and the property line. So a different stick a building on it. And show it that way. Glazed area, for as far as measurement goes, should be defined that is measured from the outside of the window frame. Every window manufacturer has a different mullion jamb detail, and nobody could truthfully specify a window that has a specified glazing, because the windows are put out to bid, and you don't know who's going to get the window. So, but if you always measure from the frame, it's always a 3x4 window if that's what you want. But the glass size is fractions of an inch, but it does add up. And then there's 3 townhouse definitions, and all 3 of them are just abysmal, and those really need a hard look at. Again, I would point you towards the International Residential Code. It actually defines what a townhouse is. It does meet the fact that a townhouse is on its own piece of property, but it says multiple dwelling units in a building. A townhouse is a building. The next townhouse, even though they're attached, is a different building. It's not the same building. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
I don't have a whole lot to say this time. One of the questions that comes up in the setback sketches that you have, where even under today's zoning, you're allowed to do an ADU in the backyard, let's say. Depending on which day of the week it is, your setbacks, you may have to have a front setback in front of the existing structure toward the street, a rear setback behind the existing house, and then we've seen where we're asked to then have another front setback before you get to the second building in the back. So essentially you end up with a front, a rear, a front, and a rear, and in some cases you wipe out the entire lot. You might go in the next week and get a different answer. So I think that's a situation that isn't covered in our current zoning. I'm not sure we're getting it here either.
Yeah, fair enough. I
Thank
think
you.
we do have a way to go on the illustrations and these setback and yard distinctions. I was reminded of that today. I spent some time with the permit staff was kind enough to point out some of those things too. So we'll make another run at some of that and get some more sophisticated drawings showing some more unusual configurations. I think we all understand it in the case of a rectangular, perfectly shaped piece of property, but it gets a little more tricky than that in real life application. So.
I think I have more questions than comments. The first question is 20.80 nonconformities. Were all the changes to the existing ordinance, were they all highlighted in the editor's notes? Uh, 20.80, the nonconforming chapter.
Well, Paul, from my perspective, the editor's notes do address the major substantive modifications. It's always possible that what I consider to be a minor editing change has more drastic implications than I imagined. But so I think the answer is yes.
Fair enough. My second question is, in the expansion of use section under nonconformities 20.80.040C, as I read it, section C is new. And my question is, could you just give me an example of how this would be implemented? Something I could put my arms around and see.
Well, let me see. There's a restaurant in an older building in a zoning district that doesn't allow restaurants. It's taking up the first floor of the building, and they want to expand into the second floor of the building. This provision would authorize the zoning administrator to allow that expansion within the building with those provisos, A, B, C, and D. If it met those limitations, he or she would be able to administratively authorize a decision that would, of course, be always appealable to the Board of Adjustment. And the notion, the driving force behind that is I find that sometimes our mindset about nonconformities were shaped at a time when we thought zoning was going to be a real panacea, and that our mindset was that all nonconforming situations were evil and should gradually be eliminated over time. That really hasn't happened. And in fact, it's an oversimplification of an issue. My experiences at least, is there are many examples of nonconforming situations that are prized assets in the community, and that by so strictly regulating them and saying you can't do this, you can't do that, we sort of force people into a position of sort of functional obsolescence and not being able to even maintain the property. And if we lighten up a little bit within confined limits, then we may help to preserve our stock of older buildings and make a more efficient use of things. So that was the driving force, and that's my example. Maybe a poor one, but it could be any use. In a building, taking up a portion of the building, they want to expand a bit within the building, not adding on to the building, but within the confines of the building. There are, in my experience, several state laws that say that that nonconformities should be allowed or are allowed to expand to take up a portion of the building that were manifestly designed for that purpose in the first place. I didn't choose to use that sort of wording, but There's precedent for that.
That's a good example, thank you.
Okay.
Jumping to 20.85.1, the administrative adjustment, Section 8, under lot area, and specifically sub A underneath there. I'm not quite sure what that would allow. Could you give me an example of that, too, in the real world?
Well, the minimum lot size for a detached house in the R7 district under this draft, the R2.7, R2.7 district, a multi-unit district. I think it's a district that permits two flats or duplexes and semi-attached two-unit townhouse buildings. The minimum lot size proposed in this draft is 3,000 square feet. Somebody has 2,997 square feet and they come in to pull a permit. This provision would authorize the granting of an administrative adjustment for that
Right.
de minimis.
That's kind of the way I read it, but
Yeah.
I wasn't too sure. So A and B are basically
They're-
one relies on the other.
They're bound together, yes.
Okay, thank you.
The A starts to read like it's a big, broad authorization, and then you find out later that it's got to be at least 95% of the otherwise applicable minimum to qualify for the administrative adjustment. Otherwise, they go and visit Michael and Lee and the Board of Adjustment.
Okay, thank you.
Lori?
Now, I didn't read this section in great detail, but my question comes around the administration, more around planning board, design review board, all of those pieces. We talked early on about who has the authority to do what and how well does it work in Missoula. And I think in the past, my personal assessment is not necessarily working at optimum level. And so I didn't know if you guys had gone back and taken a look at that at all. It didn't look like much had changed or if it was going to be addressed. Not saying, I'm just curious if we're going to broach that sometime in the next 2 years.
We have looked at it. I must admit, I don't believe that we've made tremendous headway in clarifying the sometimes confusing or conflicting roles of those two bodies. But I'm not giving up. but I need to tread carefully and more methodically. I'm particularly concerned about the role of the Design Review Board when it comes to, well, there seems to be a crossover or a fine line between alternative compliance and a variance. And I do think that we'd all benefit from a little clearer line between their authority in that regard. And like I say, I haven't nailed it yet. Staff continues to try and explain to me what the definition is, and so I'll continue to work on it.
Yeah, I just hope that you could bring examples from other communities to help shape how we could streamline our process. And you have some more homework to do, I know, on other pieces. So
I'm afraid so.
We talked about ADU and lot line housing in our committee and tonight, so I feel comfortable where we're headed with that conversation. I really liked our conversation earlier about conservation and cluster development. I think that's something we can all agree on with the ag use and those pieces, so I just want to make sure that gets carried forward. I will admit also I did not read through the sign ordinance in great detail, and I would hope that you'd be working with staff and the design review board, and I know that there's a lot of problems within that, so I would hope that there's conversation, maybe not at our level, but other more intense levels, because nobody's brought that up tonight. I just want to make sure that that's being addressed. And the last thing that I'll comment on is that I actually really appreciate the additional uses, the definitions being thrown out there. I really like the concept of bed and breakfasts, but just like with the ADU, I would want to make sure that if there are concerns about the implementation of that we address it in some sort of structure within those additional use definitions. I also like the idea of having home businesses, the cabinet maker in the garage concept, as long as there's some controls around that, I think it can be a good thing. I have a neighbor that does that right now, and I actually like visiting his shop. So I think if we can find a balance and again go back to the things that people are fearful of or things that we've seen not work, if we can address them, and I know there's no perfect solution, but I don't know if we can break out each of these sections and talk about them tonight or in a future meeting, but I think that having an open conversation about them will really help clarify things in the zoning ordinance overall for the long term. And probably just to get Ryan back on my side, I'll have to say the last controversial thing before I sign off, go Bobcats.
Okay, I'm going to be very brief. The administrative section is so long and so complex. I hope that we'll have breakout sessions on that. I am concerned that there are so many administrative decisions. Right now, there are a lot of decisions that are made administratively, small decisions, and people are getting different information from different people on different days. And how that would be controlled and how it would be, I don't know, consistent and just is difficult. And some of the issues are large, like Mike Nave mentioned. They come back and bite you if they're handled administratively. And also, if it goes to BOA, isn't there a $500? Do you have to pay to go? Isn't it a $500 fee if it's referred to the BOA? If an administrative decision meets with resistance and has to go before the BOA, doesn't the person making the appeal have to pay a $500 fee? Okay, so you want to make sure that that's... Okay. But it's important that there not be too many of those.
In the last 3 years, we perhaps have had one, maybe two. They don't come up very often.
Okay, good. The other thing, I just want to echo what Brian said about casinos and the distance from residential areas. I really think 300 feet is too close, way too close. It's not a good influence for the neighborhoods, and it's just a major concern of mine.
Okay, I would like to echo what's been said about the administrative part. Let's just streamline the process, make sure that the steps add value to the process and have clearly defined authority. And I think that is lacking in our process a bit right now. So we continue to hear that, streamline the process. The only other comment in addition to what we've had is we talk about the Central Business District and historic restoration, recreation in our Central Business District. And I would like you to consider the sign ordinance in relation to historic signage in downtowns, in particular associated to the projecting signs that were typically used and defined a lot of the character and streetscape in a downtown. And our sort of 70s style streetscape or sign ordinances eliminated those signs. And if the Wilma or the Rialto or those folks wanted to recreate what was their historic sign, they would have to go through a very onerous process. And I think that's a great thing to actually encourage and make easier. So somehow, if there could be something to address specific to the CBD, I think historic signage, that would be great.
First, I'm sorry I'm late, and you've talked about several things that I guess I was going to talk about tonight. The only one area that I'm still not understanding is the lot line residence. How does that work with the fire code? Because the fire codes require that you have to have certain distance from lot line, or you have to have a 1 hour rated wall. How does that all work together? And I can't understand this from the...
Is it from the lot line, or is it from the separation from
It's from the lot line.
From other buildings?
No, it's from the lot line. Now you can get an easement with your neighbor, And if they keep their building back 10 feet, then, yeah, then it's no problem. But there is a...
Well, no easement would be necessary here because the zoning would require that the
Wouldn't require-
building be set back, the neighboring building be separated by a minimum distance.
So would it be that 10 feet, or that would be the fire code, or would it be something else?
It's
I guess
double
that's-
the minimum setback of the zoning district.
So that would be 10 feet.
So it
then.
would be the
Okay.
10
Okay.
feet.
All right, okay. That's all I had. Some of the other things you've already talked
No,
about,
it's a good
the
question.
ADUs and that stuff, so I just...
It's a good question.
Thanks.
I don't have a lot of comments. I like the inclusion of the lot line houses. It needs some, and I think you addressed most of the concerns that I think some of the neighborhoods had. It would be in a specific development, if you will, although it could be some lots in a existing subdivision, I guess, that somebody came in and wanted to do a little project, if you will.
Yep.
As long as it met these criteria. But I think that's good. It makes the side yards more usable if they're if a person can have all of a 10-foot side yard to use rather than a 5-foot side yard on each side of his house. That's much less usable and becomes kind of a dog run or a dirt or something that it isn't used at all. So I think those are good. I like to see those included. The ADUs are obviously pretty controversial. I don't think we should, throw the baby out with the bathwater and just say, no, those are bad, period, everywhere, because I think they have a lot of potential, and certainly in some zones and in some areas I think ought to be permitted, because that's a way to get a little more diversity in our housing, and a lot of the things people have commented on. So and you're going to go back and work on that, like we talked about this afternoon. And I echo most of the comments that Heather made, except not go Cats, go Grizz.
Cancel that. I just have a couple of comments. One has to do with lot line houses, and that's, I'm having a hard time visualizing exactly what that would look like, and I'm wondering if it's possible to get some more visual aids included, that possibly something looking at a grouping of houses from the front as opposed to looking down from the top.
Okay.
And the other thing has to do with nonconformities, and that's in the description of accidental damage and destruction. I just wanted to comment that the way you have written that there and the way it's been rewritten is terrific. As an appraiser, I'm asked periodically when I'm appraising something that is a non-conforming use by lenders. They want to know, and they want to have a statement from me or have a copy from the zoning ordinance showing that something can be rebuilt or repaired if it's damaged. And in the old way, where it used a percentage of replacement costs, that sometimes was confusing to them, and they weren't real comfortable with the way it was worded. And this is much, much better, and it'll be much easier for me to explain things to them.
Good. Good. Let me tell you about the idea of illustrating the lot line house from an elevation perspective from the street. I'm happy to do that. The thing is, the fact that it's a lot line house is going to be imperceptible. I'll have a conventional house elevation next to a lot line house elevation. There's absolutely no way you can tell from the street or the sidewalk or the front yard that the two are different, because there's the spacing between the units are the same. The fact of the matter is the lot lines are not painted on lots, so we don't know where it is. But if the rhythm is the same, then it is.
If you throw a fence in there and say, here's the property line in a conventional situation, and this guy's getting half of that side yard, and this guy's getting that half.
I guess that might be an indication. If I could find an example of, and that's not uncommon, frankly, for there to be a wall or a fence in a kind of patio home lot line configuration. So I'll see if I can find it. I've looked in the past.
Well, I know somebody actually this past week emailed some pictures.
I think it was David.
David, and it didn't come through very well on my computer, so it was kind of hard to get an idea of what it looked like.
Yeah. I think he's thinking about volunteering, flying a few people out to visit his. Is it your mother? And so we could see firsthand what what's possible, but I'm not sure I've confirmed that. Linda?
Well, of course, everyone here knows what my interest is. I will say that I do read every section, and I live in the community, and I do have comments on other items besides the signage section of Module 3. And I'm not going to dwell on any of that. I'm not a lot line person for the moment because I, too, don't quite understand what we're talking about. And as for ADUs, I think you're right. We need to rethink the whole ADU situation, having problems in my home or in my neighborhood. And the home business situation, a noise factor. Fortunately, his business didn't go and he left the neighborhood last year, but the whining of his equipment in his garage was really obnoxious, to say the least. But being a good neighbor, nobody ever said anything. So I guess as I've already talked with Kirk about items I see in the rewriting of the sign regulations, and I do indeed have 4 pages, but I am not going to go item by item. I assured Kirk that I would give him a copy of my concerns. I think we all know that the ordinance definitely needed updating the terminology. I mean, we don't have light bulb signs anymore, and so on and so forth. But with the new technology, there are some questions I have, starting in obviously section .75.30, the summary table. Just one really quick little small thing I'm confused about, the new zoning designations. It just, in B1, B2, changed from 60 square foot wall sign to allowance at 50 square feet, add to ground sign. But what I'm confused is that I guess it was RH before, was 36. Now it's inclusive with R5, R4, whatever, and I won't read them all, and now it's cut back to 24 feet. So there's some things that I need to talk a little bit about with Kirk, why these are reduced. And in B1, B2, added other signs. Does this mean that they can also have the other types listed in 20.7580, which are non-illuminated small signs, et cetera, et cetera? I just want to make sure that's the case. But I have comments like this on several of the sections, and I know that I'm not going to go heavy duty into all of those with you right now because, like I say, Kirk and I have talked a little bit before the meeting, and we'll talk afterwards. Of course, the big part of the ordinance is now the inclusion of electronic message centers, and I'm relieved to say that now we have all the types of message centers, reader boards, manual, changeable, electronically controlled, digital signs all in one section. And there are some regulations that have been listed, like in section 2075.080, that I would like to very definitely discuss with Kirk about how they arrived at what they say. And I guess one of the ones I want to touch on is the changeable copy sign, which is item E in 2075.070. And item 2, it says incorporation of changeable copy elements. Item B, the changeable copy portion of the sign must not exceed 32 feet. It should say 32 square feet. That's just a little correction there. Of course, if I had 32 feet, how big could I really go? But but the main concern is, or 35% of the total area of the sign, whichever is less. Well, the ordinance reads now 50 square feet of the total sign area, whichever is larger. This has not been a problem because the sign itself can only be so large as per the zoning, the other section. So the idea of saying it could be 50% of the sign is not going to get you a huge reader board. And I think that needs to be corrected to read whichever is large, because if you take, for instance, the average, what the city ordinance starts with for most of their signs, except in special districts, is 50 square feet. If you take 35% of that, that makes the reader board only 17.5 square feet. Given the volume of traffic, the sign will be sitting out on the roadside by, giving the 35-mile-an-hour speed limit, which we all know is really 60 in the city of Missoula. The letters on that changeable copy board would be so small, or on any device, that it just would either cause the person to do a double take or squint, or it's just not a feasible thing. So I want to get with Kirk and talk a little more about that. The electronic graphic display signs, item G, changeable copies. I feel like the brightness dimming is an okay, but it should be more like midnight instead of 10 o'clock at night. And it's that's consistent through item G, electronic graphic displays, and item I and item J. I'm really pleased with item 2 on item J, changeable copy signs for specific uses. To service stations, item E, we are glad to see the addition of electronic reader boards or digital display signs for the gas price signs. To me, this cleans up that whole situation. Instead of A-frames being drug out with metal panels that fall off, or even homemade devices, this is a clean, crisp way, a one-color digital device to show. So I think that was actually a very good call there. Item L, menu board signs. Where there again, that's a new section of the ordinance. It's something that's been a problem for us for many, many years, because a menu board, 99.5% of the time, is a ground mount sign. And if you've already been allowed a ground mount sign, you cannot have a menu board even though you have a drive-up window, which makes it a little hard to place your orders and see what's on the menu. And so I was really pleased to see that they have allowed that, along with the secondary menu board, which is, as we know, is the speaker usually and the preview board that helps them in servicing us in 15 seconds or less through their window. So that, I think, was a really nice addition to the ordinance. Item 20.75.9, 0 signs for businesses that lack street frontage. Just an observation that on item A, the on-premise sign options, I've noted that the deletion from the current ordinance, the verbiage of the use of a building directory from this section, and I'd like to see that put back in, because there might be instances where where the buildings, there's no wall space for an individual small tenant sign, and where the directory would certainly help for their identity in that building. And as I mentioned before, I guess I didn't because I'm jumping now, but it's not specifically addressed in the directory signs section either. And I feel it should be. In the directory signs section, it calls it multiple development instead of multi-tenant. So I'll go over that with you, Kirk. That's jumping to another page altogether. Okay. I noticed too, and another thing to clean up, also item 1, window signs as allowed by, it says window signs as allowed by 2075-090A1 and it stops there. Oh. And then the observation I had is there's no window sign allowances in this section. So I'm not sure where that goes or what that refers to. let's see. Another thing was 2075-100 special signs reviewed by Design Review Board. We note that the deletion of building graphics from this section. Are building graphics no longer listed as signs? That's a curious question for me. It's always been that any building graphic or artwork on buildings would have to have an automatic design review, board review. So I'd like to find out which way that one goes. And item 3, special districts. We also noted that shopping center district is still listed for an automatic review by the design review board. And as we've talked earlier on in this whole project, I was wondering if it really was necessary to utilize the design and review board's time to review a sign in a shopping center district if the sign indeed met the criteria for zoning in a commercial, like C1 or C2. So I didn't know if that was something that had just been overlooked or not. And let's see. There's a couple more that are kind of dead-end sentences, and I'll talk to you about that later. We don't have to talk about them now. Let's see. Another concern is is in section 2075-170, measurement rules. Section D, building frontage, item 3, where it says that the building frontage wall is measured on one plane, and that it doesn't address, would not be able to include recesses or projections of the building. And in the current ordinance, we've always been allowed, if the plane is if it's all one plane, but say a building has a projection of windows for their dining area, then they go back 4 feet for maybe a utilitarian part of their building, and then they come back out with more windows. If we can't use, I guess I'm not making myself really clear, but I think we've never counted the reveal depth, if you will, on something that projects out, go back. It's just always on the same plane. So if from the front corner of the building wall to the back corner of the building wall is 200 feet, I think that's what should be counted as the frontage, not a plane that might only be 20 feet long, and then it breaks up into projections and that. So that was, in the measurement rules, was a kind of a concern. And I said I wasn't going to go through this, but now that I had my lifesaver and my mouth isn't as dry as it was, I'm on a roll. and the fact that this is, I guess if you would like to put it, this is my moment.
Your 15 minutes of fame.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Autographs afterwards, folks. In section 2075-180, definitions, you had an editor's note about, including measurements, in the definitions, unless I misinterpreted that. But I don't think they should be included anywhere but in the sections that list the sizes of signs and the zoning, et cetera. I think that brings us back to what we do now. We go from special districts to zoning sections to definition, and we could get 3 different answers just by doing that. So anyway, in item A in the 2075-170 measurement rules, section A, box signs, we think the word frame should be eliminated from the sentence, where it says the area of a box sign, also referred to as a cabinet sign, is determined based on outer dimensions of the frame or cabinet surrounding the sign face. And the reason for this is in the sign area definition, I think clears that up. And I'll skip to the sign definition. It says it's called area of measurement. Old terminology, I realize. In the current ordinance, we noted the deletion of the paragraph there in the current ordinance, which we think is very important, and that is the frame of a sign may be excluded from the area of measurements where such frame conveys no message and is constructed or affixed for aesthetic reasons beyond necessary supports. And I think having the word frame up there in box signs confuses me as to what a frame really is. And I think that is something that needs to be back in the ordinance. Otherwise, we take a giant step backwards in the aesthetic look of our signs. We go back to what through the years people have termed as lollipop signs. Just the face, the cabinet around it, and a stick holding it up from the ground. So I think that that's something that's really important. And I've talked to you about awning, so a little bit, there's a little something there we think. And just in the channel letter in the same section, I think you should add may be illuminated, because it doesn't say whether they have to be anywhere, where they have to be illuminated or non-illuminated. And channel letters are always, a channel letter style letter is always illuminated, so I think that needs to be added to that. Let's see. I'm actually almost done because I've done a lot of skipping around in here. We feel that the ordinance is definitely being clarified. We're finding that it's nice to see terminologies. There are a few areas where we just need to add, like for a material use, as I mentioned to you earlier, where it defines the say for an awning or the canopy structure as made out of plastic or metal or wood or glass. I think we need to add the word fabric. It's consistently, it was never in the original ordinance, but with this umbrella product, which is a canvas, I think it should have fabric. And there are signs that are eternally illuminated that have flex faces, which is a fabric. It's a perforated fabric for wind load, but even your small signs, some of those have. So I just think that probably you'll all be relieved, probably brings me to a conclusion here with the fact that I know that we'll be able to go talk and go over a few of these small suggestions that we have and talk about the one I highlighted in hot orange, the electronic message center areas. And it's just, I think it's really good to see that finally, I feel confident that with the changing of terminology and the updating of some of the technical wording, that a person can read this section other than a sign industry person and say, oh, that's what my sign is, or yeah, that's where I have to go, you know. And I think it clarifies it for the public, and I'm done.
Thank you for your help. I look forward to getting those written comments, and I encourage all of you, as many of you have done in the past, to leave me with more detailed written comments. And I think we will probably take you up on the idea of the breakout sessions that I mentioned earlier were, I think, a great exercise, and I think we'll continue that. We'll address some of the procedural and administrative issues. I must say that I think some of the perception about the bulk of the administration and procedural was really an attempt to sort of make the rules and procedures a little more transparent so that people could kind of pick it up. And I think it's also due to the fact that very rarely do any of us pick up the ordinance and try and plow through the administrative and procedural sections. So being asked to do so was, I'm sure, a daunting task. I really think that by and large the processes we have are reflective of the requirements for public notice and hearing and the authority given to various review and decision-making bodies. But we'll continue to look at opportunities for streamlining. Now, I know there were some folks who wanted to comment, and I'd like to go ahead and do that. Laval wants to take a break. I want to continue. But let's take some public comment on Module 3. And Lavelle, you can have a break if you'd like one.
Well, I was eating one of those delicious cookies. I'm going to skip around here a couple of things. One is that comes to my mind the most, and I know you talked about it, but practical difficulties at the Board of Adjustments. That word is so wide open. Practical for me might not be practical for you. I think that ought to be eliminated, but I know you already had a discussion on that. Signage. The whole thing needs to be really clear. For instance, we got a thing going now that what constitutes a second floor? Is the mechanic room a second floor, or is it not a second floor? Is the second floor counted if it's public use? I think it should be counted if it's used for the public, not if it's used for mechanic. Working construction for all the years I did. St. Pat's is a good prime example. I worked on that. There's a mechanic room up there. We don't count that as the 7th floor. So those kind of things I think need to be more clear in there, and maybe that would help some of the difficulties we see. You need to touch on color of the lights, I guess, because we had an appeal here, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago between red and yellow. I thought it was kind of a crazy appeal, but there's nothing in there, stating really the color. It's just the brightness of it and stuff, and I don't know if you want to get into color or not. As I said before, I appreciate that you're taking the ADUs back and looking at that ordinance. I had so many things written down, I can't remember them all, but I guess my last thing that I'm going to voice my concern on is giving the zoning officer all the power that it seems to be giving them in the different things. One's a non-conformity up to 50%. The zoning officer has bosses. The bosses are politicians. They either are county commissioners, they're their city council, or they're the administration. And so that makes me leery of giving that zoning officer so much power in making those decisions without those decisions maybe going to the council or whatever body, or the county commissioners, because county city shares those responsibilities in the OPG office where the zoning officer comes from. They're going to be, that zoning officer is going to be influenced by what his bosses want. So I have a tendency not to want to give that a whole bunch of power, because, this 4 years it might be great. The next 4 years it might not be great. Mm-hmm. So I'd like that to go in front of more of a review or something like that. I had other comments, but I'll give somebody else a chance. Thank you.
Good. Before I forget it, I want to kind of take that up. I know that I've heard some concerns or some questions about, are we expanding the administrative staff's authority too much? I really thought we had kind of sort of the path I chose to take in this draft was this one that does some bounded delegation, that we delegate to appropriate levels decision-making authority, preserving their right for the applicant or an aggrieved party to appeal that decision. And it was partly due to the suggestion that we streamline the process, particularly for things that were not of citywide or even broad area significance. And if we've kind of missed the mark in defining what those are, then I'm looking forward to hearing specifically about those things. But by and large, the attempt has been to not delegate to staff decisions that involve unbridled discretion, but to rather define some objective criteria and allow administrative staff to make decisions on some discrete, expressly identified issues. And I think that can work. I think that there's some There's always some hesitation, but I think I think there's an opportunity to kind of stick our toe in the water and try with a few things, and maybe have some reporting requirements and test it over time, see how it's working. If it's not working, then we'll take it back through a process. But in order to respond to your cries for administrative streamlining and efficiency in the review process, I do think this is a technique that really offers an opportunity to do some of that. So I'm looking forward to some specific comments about where I've overstepped.
I don't have any comments about overstepping. Frankly, I didn't read a lot of the staff or the administrative staff suggestion. Let me share with you experiences that I've had. Is different cities, in fact, most cities, in my experience, will have people manning the counter, as we call the counter at the planning, or OPG. And some days it may be one person, and the next day it's somebody else. And somebody goes in and asks for advice or a decision, and the person that's there on Monday may give one answer, the person that's there on Tuesday may give another answer, which leads to confusion, and I've seen it lead to lawsuits. As long as you have an appellate procedure, so that if there are different answers being given and word can get around, well, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said that, I think it's okay, and I think it's a good thing to streamline the permit process by giving staff some discretion. But either OPG or whoever it might be would be well advised to have the same person handle the same requests or the same permits rather than have different people on different days. I'm not sure they even do that here, but I've sure seen it done elsewhere. And either have the same person doing the same thing or have an appellate procedure so that an aggrieved party can appeal to a greater authority, if you will, or have both, best of all possible worlds.
More public comment. I'm sorry to have interrupted us. Additional.
This is Celeste River, a citizen who lives in Farview's Patty Canyon neighborhood on the hill. And I haven't been to a meeting in quite a while and didn't know that at this meeting you'd be going over the Board of Adjustment part of the new module. So as you started talking about it, then that began to remind me about things, about the Board of Adjustment. It's been several years since I've paid attention. But this thing about the issue about the words practical difficulties, I have some information in my files, and I'd like someone to ask me to dig them up and actually know that they're going to then be looked at. It has to do with back around 1999 or 2000 when there were some changes made, and I'm not sure if it's signs used to be handled by the Board of Adjustment. As I'm just recalling now what's in these papers in my files. Signage used to be handled by the Board of Adjustment, and then it was split and given over to, I think it's the Design Review Board. And so there was a person who came to the podium at that time and warned about leaving the words practical difficulties in the Board of Adjustment's duties, because it had to do with when they'd handled signage. And practical difficulties are come up in dealing with signs. But it was not about houses and structures and the typical things that the Board of Adjustment now only handles. So I think that there's some clarity in those notes, those minutes from those public hearings when that occurred, that would be informative and helpful in this problem about practical difficulties still being combined with unnecessary hardships. They're separate things, and the practical difficulties was left behind, and there was a citizen who warned about that and the problems that would occur because of that. And I can find it if I know that it will be worth my time to look again for it. And I also believe it should be removed because it can be misused and abused. What happened in my experience was a variance that had been granted and then it resurfaced 15 years later. It was granted during a time when variances were expired. There was an expiration time to variances. It wasn't a law. It was in the Board of Adjustments. It was their first amendment ever put on the Board of Adjustments, what do you call it? Bylaws. And at that time, for at least 10 years, the variances expired. Even a business like Safeway got warning letters their variance would expire. So it was something that had clout, it had power. At that time, this variance didn't get expired. No letters about it or anything. It just kind of rode underneath the wire. The property was sold half a year after the owner received this variance in the summertime. And it resurfaced 2 owners later, 15 years later, for a plan that was different than it had been granted for, a 3-story structure instead of a 2-story structure. So that's what brought my life into a different alignment, where I began to be involved in these meetings and speaking up for the citizens. So I don't see anything just skimming over this that shows anything about that a variance is granted for a certain plan and that it can only be used for that plan. If they change the plan, they should get a new variance. If the architectural plans are changed. Okay. But I'm just skimmed it over tonight. I'd also like to see something in here that assures how records are kept for the Board of Adjustment. I haven't gone back and looked for the last few years to see if records are actually being kept in such a manner that a citizen 10 years later could look back at what happened or what was supposed to be in place about a variance, or even how a citizen who buys a property next door or near surrounding a property that has a variance would even be able to easily find that there is a variance on that property. It was a convoluted procedure to find that out in the past. And in today's new technology, it seems like it should become easier for citizens, for people to know if there are variances on properties near them. So I'd like to see something that puts in place some requirements for record keeping. Are the records now that are being kept, archived about the Board of Adjustments proceedings, are they now including correspondence, letters? Is there an assurance that the neighboring people's comments are going to be kept in a way that you know what their name was and what their address was and what they had to say about it? And the minutes, if the minutes are being kept, since it is quasi-judicial, if the minutes are being kept accurately, if they're paying for a secretary who can understands legal terminology and can spell words the way they are meant to be, not just the way they sound, but the real actual words that people are saying. And also, if it's a quasi-judicial body, if they wouldn't be required to administer oaths. If oaths had been administered at my appeal, people would have either been lying under oath or, maybe saying things differently than they did say, because they weren't required to have an oath, to take an oath. But in the state, I think it's in the state law, boards of adjustment have the power, and I think it should be the duty to administer oaths. Because people can say anything, but it's when they have their conscience becomes involved. Okay, let's see. And I see that when it talks about lapse of approval, number H, item H under 2085080, lapse of approval, the word lapse is used in most of the references in here, but under number 2, it uses the word before a variance expires, and I think the word expires should replace the word lapse, because to me this word lapse can almost be revived. If something lapses, I don't have a dictionary here to look it up and clarify that for sure, but if something lapses, you could revive it. You could maybe bring new life to it. And if it expires, it's done. You have to get a new one. So I think that when a variance expires, the wording in this legal law, which you're making here, should say expires and have a consistency of terminology, not one sentence says lapse and another sentence says expires, because then that implies that they're different things, that they have different meanings. Let's see, term. Then about who, I just heard people talking about the zoning officer and getting too much power to make these decisions. And what I learned was that if the citizen, and this is confusing for people, when a person goes to the Board of Adjustment for a variance, they're actually appealing. They're making an appeal for a variance. But then, if an administrative officer makes a decision that a person wants to appeal, they go to the Board of Adjustments for an appeal, to make an appeal. And what I got involved in was making an appeal of an administrative officer's decision about the use of this old variance for a different plan than it had been granted for. Well, what we found was that when we made that appeal, we had to do all of our communication with the zoning office, because the zoning office keeps all the records of the Board of Adjustment. They send out the notices to the neighbors. They put up the signs. They put the notice in the newspaper. Every step of the way was abominable. Every step of the way they didn't even have a note card to say what our appeal was. It looked as though we were appealing for a variance for our neighbor's property. So, and the I'm sure the Office of Planning Grants has corrected some of those problems now, because they were pointed out so clearly by us. Every step of the way we found problems. But the big problem was that we were appealing an administrative officer's decision in the Office of Planning and Grants, an OPG administrative officer's decision, and we were turning in we were going to them for help in making the appeal. So we were thwarted because we weren't going to some other office to help us make the appeal against the zoning officer's decision. We had to go to that zoning officer's office to make our appeal. And I think there's a problem in that. And we suggested that the Board of Adjustments records and all of their business like that should be kept by some other office, not the zoning officer's office. Because there's a saying about that. Well, it's a conflict of interest for sure. You're going to the, I can't think of what it is, they don't really, a person doesn't really want to help you if they're the one that you're appealing what they've said. So I think that there should be a correction of that, because really the citizen, unless they have a lot of power in the town, does not have much power there at City Hall. If they make an appeal of a zoning office decision, they have to turn the appeal in to the zoning office where that person works, and both those entities and the Board of Adjustment are all being advised by the city attorney. I thought the city attorney was there to protect me, the citizen. But the zoning officer, the zoning office, and the Board of Adjustment were all seeking the assistance of the city attorney. So those are my experiences. That's what I think are some problems that are maybe not addressed here. And they're real problems that a real person experienced. Thank you for listening. Considering.
Thank you. I think I've got the technology sort of figured out. Just preface this by thanking all of you for your diligence and the inordinate amount of time you take to look at detail. As a new member or a new person coming to this, I'm amazed by the amount of time that you deal with not minuscule issues, but very, very precise issues. I'm Mike Jakubczyk from the University Homeowners Association. I have written comments, and I'll see if I can shorten these and move through. Specifically, we have 7 concerns with Module 3. The context, I guess, is that we believe that your group and the folks working with you were seen to rewrite existing zoning regulations to clear up conflicting language, not to rekindle old conflicts over the last decade or so with regard to infill and stresses on neighborhoods. And that, again, the purpose of the rewrite was to clarify confusing language and inconsistencies in existing zoning regulations. So we have concern over the modules being produced over the last several months that have maybe strayed a bit from those original caveats. So here's the 7 concerns, and I'll try to be brief. First, the increase in peak height allowed in residential districts from 30 to 35 feet will ease transitions of neighborhood building size from 2 stories to possibly 3 stories. We reject arguments that the existing 30-foot limit is in any way ambiguous and that the so-called height standard is designed for hilly terrain, or that a 35-foot height standard applied across several zones is necessary or desirable. Secondly, I've heard a lot of discussion about the lot line houses. We're concerned that those developments are not specifically excluded from existing neighborhoods. It appears to us that these plans may be suitable for developers without necessarily a lot of input from private citizens, and since in most cases its application is to lots where a developer is doing the planning. It may be destined to set up tension and conflict between future householders as they work to resolve conflicts regarding access, maintenance created by perhaps ill-conceived developments. 3, a major concern is that your documents fail to address massing standards, that is, the relationship between the size of a house versus the size lot. It's an omission that we note, and if perhaps it was included in your regulations, would go some way to preserve the character of existing neighborhoods without necessarily having to create historic district overlays. 4th, we've talked a little bit about ADUs, and I won't go into that section, but we have significant concerns within the university area for many of the reasons that you as members have already expressed. I'm almost to the end. 5, it appears to us, and as somebody that always likes clarification, that the renaming of the zoning districts, for example, from R1 to R5.4, actually confuses and muddies and clarifies language in a zoning document. In that example, there's actually a new R1 which bears little resemblance to the current R1. 6, it's unclear why it's necessary to increase the density of PUDs by 50%. 7, growing our group living standards in the document codify what's been going on by default in Missoula for the last several decades. It also codifies overload of existing infrastructure and unequal sharing of the burdens of maintaining that infrastructure. For example, a sewer bill on a house occupied by 8 adults is significantly less than the sewer bill on an apartment dwelling consisting of single units occupied by an equal number of people. So those of us in the neighborhoods look for you to protect those neighborhoods. And that it is our clear understanding that the zoning documents that you're so carefully going over are designed to do that. And we call on you to continue to do your part. And I have a written copy for all of you, and thank you for your time.
I'm Renee Mitchell. I sit on the council, and I appreciate that there are a lot of you watching out over these zoning rewrites, because I don't think without your help, Mr. Bishop, and the people who have lived in this city and care about it, would keep a good eye on this. We need to keep a good eye on this. I'll just try to be brief here. Let's delete the practical difficulty thing. I was at a meeting last night, and that was a big thing that came up. It's so unclear that it probably shouldn't be there. I mean, it definitely should not be there. Building heights. The trouble with building heights in the past is that the bases have been measured from different areas. So we measure from the base area as you've described in this zoning thing, but let's not bring them up to 35 feet. We're buying open space so that we can see the view shed. Why cut out our light and our views with this kind of construction, especially in this valley? We know what it's like to get inversions in this valley, and we know how dark it can be in the winter anyway without having our light diminished by a building 6 feet away from us. ADUs, I'm glad you're going to go over that. Used indiscriminately throughout the town will bring a storm that will rival the controversy over the former infill and PNC rules. Lot line houses. I had an opportunity to speak with Don Elliott, who's also a planner out of Denver. I asked his idea on it, and he said they all have to be done in the same area, and I would never do too many of them because you will have a blighted area if you do. Parking. Anytime we're going to allow infill, we've got to allow places for people to park their automobiles, bicycles, whatever they're going to be riding in the next 25 years. And not on the street so that the fire trucks can't get by. This is a big, big problem already in areas where you have multiple people occupying one dwelling unit, and you're going to have a big problem with ADUs on that. And I will just stop right there. Thank you for all your work.
Just some quick points to add to your list of considerations. I think from the building industry standpoint, the concern over administrative adjustments isn't so much what you would be allowing to be adjusted as it would be the discretion and the level, how far we would have to go back in the process if the administrative adjustment wasn't approved. We went through a similar discussion with the county, and I think we came close to where we wanted to go, but I think if we maybe work out some parameters to satisfy folks like John, I think his concerns are understandable, and we've shared those in the past as well. Maybe parameters in the sense of from here to there, and maybe, I know you do set up some standards, but maybe just give it a more of a degree of variance that they're allowed to work within, rather than just set a bare minimum. And then the second item was on variances. We had a similar problem on the definition of hardship at the county, and maybe delineate what we in the city will acknowledge as hardship, like the the physical aspect of the land, uniqueness of the property, maybe delineate those issues that really are hardships that we either in practice or in prescription would like to have as our definition, and just be a little bit more clear on that. And then at that point, I think it'd be fine if you got rid of the other, practical difficulties. Like I think in terms of figuring out what it is that we will qualify as hardship is maybe the discussion that we could bring the discussion there instead. And then just in a general note, just remind people that going into this zoning rewrite, we're also dealing with a great deal of infill potential or vision from the growth policy amendments. And, we hear that the community wants us to build things in a certain way in certain areas, and we're willing to do that. And the question when we come to something like this is, can we? And just want to remind you of that, we're compromising things too. So just, put that out there as an ask for more compromise on maybe some issues that maybe are a little uncomfortable, because they're uncomfortable for us too. All right, thanks.
Excuse me, the administrative adjustment comment. Were you arguing for wider latitude?
Not so much wider latitude, but I think John was concerned that maybe he would be turning over too much power to an administrative agent. And, I think one thing that the city council can do is set very specific parameters, which I think is what you were saying, and just saying, maybe say there's a beginning point and an end point. Parameters rather than just a bar that they have to meet, if that makes any sense. Because it might depend on the adjustment you're making, but because there's like 10 of them.
I thought we had done that in there, but perhaps we need some additional work on that. So thank you.
Lynn Hellegard, I'm on City Council as well. Just another couple quick thoughts. By having one zoning officer, if your sole purpose is to streamline the process, you may not be in fact doing that. I know in the past with the zoning permits, we own a sign business, my husband and I, and when we would go for sign permits, if that person was on vacation for 2 weeks, you couldn't get a permit for 2 weeks if they were out sick. You couldn't get them for 4 weeks to 6 weeks. So it didn't streamline the process at all, but I do appreciate the fact that a different person is going to give you a different answer. So you need to address that as well. Another concern, just because we have to keep beating this ADU to death, there are people that are concerned that when you start building these ADUs on the alleys, which are not wide enough to get your fire trucks down, are we then going to get in a situation where we're condemning those properties, taking of land to make those alleys wide enough to accommodate an alley house? So you're infringing on your neighbor's rights, so you can put an alley house, say 3 houses in. The ones down the street, their backyards are going to be taken in order to make it, to comply with safety issues. So I just keep that in mind as well. Thanks.
Great. Nope. One shot. Go ahead, David.
I guess one of the things, this is actually kind of to the audience members to help me understand, maybe the rest of the board. In the BOA where it says hardship, you get to do something for hardship, what would you call it? I mean, what would be why would you be able to go there to the BOA?
Hardship is like pornography. It's bothered the Supreme Court for years. Nobody knows what's pornography in the minds or eyes of one person may not be in the eyes of the justice sitting next to that one justice. So it would be difficult, I think, to put this is what a hardship is, or this is what an undue hardship is. The difficulty with the practical difficulty thing, in my opinion, is it's just not authorized. If it were authorized, it really isn't any different than undue hardship. What is a practical difficulty? What is pornography? What is an undue hardship? What is pornography? There's something come up on a case-by-case basis. The key thing, because the appeals go to the district court, is that whatever the Board of Adjustments determines has to be supported by findings of fact. And that is the case with most appeals of anything, lawsuits or whatever. And we do that. But I think it would be very difficult to define an undue hardship or a practical difficulty for that matter. I was thinking during all the discussion, there is a way to get some clarity if there is confusion. I mean, I'm of the opinion that we're only allowed to grant variances for undue hardships. The city attorney thinks that there's other statutes that suggest that practical difficulties are also grounds for a variance. I would think that we could solicit an opinion from the Attorney General of the state of Montana saying this is the issue. The statute says undue hardship. For whatever reason, other statutes may imply that practical difficulties can also be considered. What is the opinion of the Attorney General? He's the highest law officer of the state. So either a council person, the mayor, or the city attorney, and I guess a member of the Board of Adjustments or any board or any citizen could request an opinion from the Attorney General and see if we could put this to bed. But it gets back to that same question, what is an undue hardship and what is a practical difficulty? So,
Heather and then Celeste, go ahead. Yeah, Heather, go ahead.
From listening and in the past, I think bashing staff has become a pretty popular sport in Missoula. And so I just like to point out and go on record to say that staff has had to interpret this absolute beast of a zoning ordinance. And I've had my own frustration going in and trying to follow the ordinance. They're interpreting it. I think if we do our jobs properly here and work as a team and make it clear, an ordinance that's clear, it will not only help us on the outside, but it'll also help staff do interpretations so that we have less conflict. And I think that's the overall goal. And I think that we need to give staff the proper authority to make logical decisions and implement this ordinance, because I don't think it's City Council's job to redraw lines in a subdivision. I mean, that's not a good use of their time, and it's not a good use of the staff that are paid professionals. So I think if we can find the right balance and clean up what's been such a heavy heartache for a long time for everybody, it'll make everybody's jobs clear, and we could dip our toes in the water, as you said, of giving that proper authority and streamlining the system, and hopefully avoid a lot of the arguments that we've had to deal with because of what's the big elephant is the ordinance itself, not individuals.
Great.
Celeste River again. I didn't hear you talking about heights, measurement of heights after I came in tonight, so I didn't know that was something that came up. So I'd just like to put it on the record that I disagree with the compromise between 40 and 30 feet going to 35 feet, particularly because of the little hidden extra 3 feet that can be added on to a 30-foot height structure because of a gabled roof. So that when people think that in their zone a structure can only be 30 feet, it could actually be 33 feet. And when structures were being measured by a third method that nobody even knew existed unless you knew it, called hillside method, which allowed 8 feet of fill to be put in along the side of a house, and then the measurement starting from there, a 30-foot structure could be 38 feet plus 3 feet, 41 feet, in theory. So is it that if you go to 35 feet, in theory, actually it could be 38 feet, with that extra 3 feet of the gabled roof, hidden little way of getting or measuring another 3 feet without showing it? Would that still be in there? So that in essence, really, you're going to have a 38-foot structure is being built when people think it's 35. And I I think people should have to appeal or apply for a taller structure in our community and leave it at 30 feet, where we don't live in a big city somewhere else. We live here, and I said it yesterday at the smaller meeting. People come here from other places, or they've moved away and they come back, and they've gotten used to everybody blocking everybody else's view and just learning to live with it. And we have a choice to either live in that kind of community and develop and build that kind of a community with that kind of a spirit. I think of it as a mean spirit, or a view hog spirit. And if we want to live in that kind of a community, or if we want to say and describe and architecturally design a community, not just individual structures that are only intended to satisfy the person who's paying the money to build that structure for themselves. It's what kind of a community do we want to live in, one that cares about each other or one that's out for the individual? And I think we should really think about that. Thank you.
Brett, I want to take a second and talk about this height thing. Just to clarify that not everybody attended the height discussion yesterday. I thought it was a productive discussion, really constructive. Let me remind everybody what the system is today. The ordinance defines two methods of measuring building height. What it calls the absolute height method, which is really this line here in both of these drawings. The topmost portion of the building to grade beneath. That's the absolute method. There is another method called the modified height method. And that's this method that measures to the midpoint between the peak of the roof and the underside of the eave, or something to that effect, but midway up a pitched roof. I think that origins of that date to the hillside ordinance, and I think it was intended to maybe apply in it, but the ordinance doesn't really say that. And as a result, nearly everybody today, or its wide use of the modified height method of measurement is widespread. The point that I thought we all agreed we wanted to get to was a single, understandable, and transparent way of measuring building height. Not to pretend that portion of the building didn't exist and potentially impact someone's view or potentially cut off light and air, but to say, that's the building, let's measure the darn thing. And if we do that, given the fact that we measure height like this today, if we keep the height limit the same, 30 feet, we're in fact downzoning what's allowed. And fair's fair. If we're not upzoning as a part of this process, let's not downzone as a part of this process. And that was the origin of the recommendation to change the height limit to 35 feet, to address the fact that we were now going to insist that you measure to the top part of the building. Celeste mentions another interesting wrinkle that exists in the ordinance. Not only does it define the absolute height method of measurement and the modified height method of measurement, there is a provision lurking in the ordinance that additionally says if you have a building with a roof that's a pitch of 712 or greater, you get 3 feet of additional height. 20%. That's right, 20%. So at the 30 feet, using that, if you have a steeply pitched roof, you're at 36 by use of the 20 feet, and then you can use the modified. So let's compare what we're really doing. I think that wasn't necessarily intentional, but the proposal that's now on the table would in fact prevent that people from double dipping, using the modified method and using the 20% for the 712 pitch. That's right. That to answer directly the question I think Celeste was posing, would the 20% rule still be in effect? And no, the proposal is absolute height. Modified goes away, the 20% exemption goes away, and we measure to the topmost portion of the building. But to do that, and to do that fairly, we need to increase maximum building height to 35 feet to make up for the fact that we're now measuring to a higher point on the building.
From where?
From grade. Well, the ordinance, as, yeah, I'd have to check the exact language. It is in there. And that's, where is it? Vertical distance from natural or finished grade, whichever is lower.
Whichever is lower, but the natural grade is often undeterminable because the bulldozers have already come in before anybody got track of what the natural grade was.
Well, in that case, we would have to default to finished grade. And it's still, this still doesn't represent an increase in maximum building height.
Unless they put in 8 feet of fill. The way that noted architects, who I became acquainted with, did not even know that hillside, the third and hidden hillside method was being used for height measurements. And they, at that time, told me that they were using a method where you went down to the bottom side of the hillside slope structure where people walk out their sliding door, and that's where the height started to be taken, up to the envelope, that thing in the air, that line going down, parallel line following the slope, the existing slope. And that envelope was measured from where you stepped out at your sliding door down in your family room on the bottom side of any hillside house. You stepped out on the ground there, and that's where you went up. And then this other third way that wasn't even on the building permits, there was only absolute and modified for boxes to check off. There was a third way called hillside, and noted architects did not know that was being used. And that was where they were able to put in 8 feet of fill along the side and just measure from there. It could have been a little pile of dirt 8 feet tall and start measuring from there.
Brett, I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead, and Lee, I know you had your hand up as well.
All right. I appreciate the diagram, and I think you should bring it to every meeting, and we'll go over it right at the start. So my view on this is that the design integrity of what we're looking at here is kept intact. And for me, a couple of feet, from my own personal view, is not a substantial revision to the thing. And so as we consider this upgrade to this document, I think we need to keep in mind that we are all going to be better as a community to adopt this document as a rewrite. We're all going to be better, and if we get caught in the minutia of splitting hairs and digging in over small issues, we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we cannot afford to do that as a community. So please be willing to consider other people's views and really think about the principle of the design and not get caught up so much in the I'm right versus somebody else is right.
I'd like to comment on this height stuff because it seems to me that we're trying to apply a height criteria throughout the community, which covers dense neighborhoods where a higher building 15 feet from the neighbor is going to be very intrusive. But we're also dealing with properties on the urban fringe where people may be building on 40 acres or 10 acres. And maybe their house is down towards the bottom of a valley, and a 45-foot, 50-foot house wouldn't block anyone's view. And there's also the situation where a small house doesn't have to won't be as high because, you know, he's this big and you're a peak roof, so you're only this way. But if somebody's building a house like this and his peak roof goes up, he's higher, right? So using this firm height criteria for all cases, no matter where it is or what kind of house, we're precluding certain architectural styles, and we're actually telling some people they can't build a big house in Missoula County.
That's where the Board of Adjustments come in.
Yeah, but they're pretty, they don't very often vary from the written regulations.
Try us.
I want to end tonight by talking about upcoming events, but Lee, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yesterday, after our discussion, we sort of settled on 33-foot height for R1 and A because they're established neighborhoods, and the existing houses are, many of them, only a story and a half. If you go 35 feet, you can actually do a 3-story house. So we came up with 2 stories and 33 feet in order to kind of keep, in those districts, keep a certain quality of building so that it didn't become intrusive for neighbors, because we are tightly packed anyway. And I thought that's where we ended up, at 33 and 2 stories.
We did leave yesterday's meeting with a kind of tentative direction and you were going to talk to some of your colleagues about that.
The other thing was on this mill site development, which is going to be very close to many small homes, the city council easily agreed to structures in that area. I don't remember the exact height, but some of them as high as 100 feet, maybe higher, weren't they, Brent? Huh? Yeah. So we're all uptight about a single-family house, 30 or 35 feet, but then we turn a blind eye to other developments. You're going to block the whole mountain from a whole subdivision. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure which side you're arguing there, but that's a good point. Let's talk about not having any more 3-hour meetings, and let's talk about what's coming up. I can tell you a couple of dates for certain that I'm hopeful that we'll see each other again. The first is coming up pretty quick, Wednesday, December 10th. From 7 to 9, we're going to take another opportunity to invite the public in to catch up and learn about what we've been up to and give us their views. That's going to be from 7 to 9 on, again, December 10th. That's a Wednesday night, and we're going to be back at the Children's Theater in that space that we used for, I think, our last public workshop. Yeah, upstairs. No? No?
No. This time you got to go through the main lobby and go up the elevator. It's in the new portion of the building, just above the lobby, kind of. Okay? Yes. Blue room? Blue room.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. No, I'm sorry. Great. And since you don't have anything going on that time of year, we're going to meet the next night to kind of debrief, have a holiday celebration. That will be back at our regular 7 o'clock meeting time. Yes, here in the council chambers. Thursday, December 11th, We'll talk to Laval and Jen about what they have in store for us, snack-wise. But and then I don't have any specific dates, but just to kind of describe for you generally how I see things going after the first of the year. We will be delivering the fourth and final piece of this overall initial draft pretty soon. Sometime in the next few weeks. And we'll be having a meeting about that in January as an advisory group. Very likely will be this room very likely it'll be a Thursday night, and very likely our 7 to 9. That's going to primarily be the subdivision piece, we don't envision to be big, substantial changes. The city has done a lot of work on its subdivision regs in recent years, and we're not going to revisit that. We're not anticipating that. So it'll be more a matter of making sure that the subdivision and zoning regs are kind of working in sync and doing that sort of thing. There's also a couple of lingering pieces of the zoning that we'll likely deliver with Module 4. But then we'll have a complete initial draft, and then we're going to prepare a consolidated revised draft that shows you exactly what we've changed since the time that you saw the original draft. So you've received 4 modules in their original form. The next time you see them, they'll be all bound together, and we will redline and highlight and underline, and kind of in a legislative format, what's changed since you first saw the draft, so you can zero in on what's new from the last time you saw it. That's a consolidated revised draft. We'll have an advisory group meeting about that. Then we want to have a public workshop to discuss it. Then we'll revise it again, and we'll begin the formal public hearing process. And so we're looking at first quarter of 09 as when all that's going to transpire in our that's our goal anyway. I'm sorry? Well, hillside design is one of those lingering pieces of zoning. It also crosses over into subdivision. It's a challenging piece. I'm still kind of floundering with it. What's that, David? That makes sense to me. I will endeavor to do that. So to the extent that Hillside addresses building design elements, and to me that's frankly still an open question about the extent to which the Hillside design standards should delve into that. To some extent, with regard to retaining walls and other elements, it may be unavoidable, but it's confusing to me how it works now. So that's what I see. I appreciate you coming tonight, everybody hanging in for the full 3 hours, and I'll look forward to seeing you in a few weeks. Thanks a lot.